समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. 3 months before the European Union banned Brazilian beef, India signed a trade deal with Brussels. Now that's not a coincidence I'm pointing out just for drama, it's the whole story. Because buried inside Europe's other big trade agreement, the one with Mercosur, is a single clause that tells you almost everything about how a smart country protects itself in a trade deal. And whether India's own trade agreement with the EU got that part right or not. So today I'm going to walk you through one clause, 3 economic ideas that explain why it exists and what it means for India's next move. Let's start with the timeline. The EU-Mercosur agreement, that's the trade pact between the European Union and the Mercosur, the South American bloc of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay, took 25 years to negotiate. 25 years. Brazil, the biggest economy in that bloc, waited the longest of anyone for its tariffs to finally come down. The deal was implemented on the 1st of May this year. 11 days later, just 11 days, Brussels announced a ban on Brazilian beef. It also announced a ban on chicken, eggs, and honey, citing concerns about antibiotic use on Brazilian farms. Now, the ban takes effect in September. Brazil was blindsided. It's already said it will contest the decision. Now, if you are Brazil, that looks like a betrayal. 25 years of negotiating and the market access you were promised evaporates in under 2 weeks. But here's the twist. Brazil isn't left empty-handed. And that's because of one particular clause written into the treaty years before anyone knew it would be needed. That clause is called the rebalancing mechanism. Here's what it does. If a new EU rule on food safety, on emissions, on anything ends up taking away market access that Mercosur was promised in the first place, Mercosur doesn't have to go back to the negotiating table and beg. The treaty already guarantees compensation. That could mean a cash payment, a bigger quota somewhere else, or a lower tariff on a different product. And crucially, Brazil doesn't even have to request it. It's automatic, built into the contract, agreed to years before the specific beef ban was even dreamt up. Think of it like a prenup, but for trade. Nobody wants to imagine the relationship falling apart, but writing down what happens if it does before either side is angry means you're negotiating from a place of calm logic instead of a crisis or resentment. So the question is, why would the EU agree to hand Mercosur that kind of insurance policy? This is where it gets very interesting. And this is where we bring in some real economic theory. The first idea comes from the economist Mancur Olson, who in 1965 described something called the logic of collective action. Olson's insight was this: small, tightly organized groups almost always beat large, diffuse ones in a political fight, even when the large group vastly outnumbers them. Now, the question is why? Because for each member of a small group, the outcome matters enormously. A farmer whose livelihood depends on beef prices will show up, he will protest, lobby, and vote on that one issue. But for each individual consumer, a slightly higher grocery bill barely registers. So millions of consumers stay quiet while a much smaller number of farmers make an enormous amount of noise and they win. Now, European farmers are a minority of the EU's population, but they are extraordinarily well organized. And that organization is precisely why Brussels felt it had to act on the beef ban, protests and all, regardless of what the trade agreement promised Brazil. Now, the second idea builds directly on top of that, and it's called the developmental paradox. This comes from economists Kim Anderson and Yujiro Hayami, who studied this pattern back in 1986. Their finding was almost counterintuitive. As a country's agricultural sector shrinks, as farming becomes a smaller and smaller share of the economy, that sector tends to get more protected, not less. Now, the question is, why would a shrinking industry get more powerful? Because the cost of protecting it gets spread across more and more consumers. So each person barely feels it, while the benefit gets concentrated into fewer and fewer farmers, so each one feels it enormously. Europe is that textbook case of this. Agriculture is a small sliver of the EU economy, and yet European farmers routinely shape trade policy in ways far bigger than their economic weight would suggest. Put Olson's logic and the development paradox together, and you get a country that will quietly tighten rules on its trade partners again and again in ways that never quite make headlines until they suddenly do. The rebalancing mechanism is unusual precisely because it drags that quiet pressure out into the open and puts a price on it years in advance. Now, the third idea is about why Brussels can promise something in a treaty and then seemingly break it anyway. This one comes from the political scientist Robert Putnam, who in 1988 described what he called two-level games. Putnam's point was that any international negotiator is actually playing two negotiations at once. One is with the foreign country across the table, and the other is with their own domestic audience, their parliament, their courts, their farmers, their voters back home. A deal only survives if it works at both levels simultaneously. Now, Brussels succeeded at the international level with Mercosur, but at home, it is still fighting battles. And in fact, the European Parliament has referred the entire agreement to the EU's top court, specifically challenging whether the rebalancing mechanism is even legal. That's delayed full ratification by more than even a year. Meanwhile, the beef ban went ahead anyway, because the domestic political game and the legal game don't have to move in sync. They just both have to eventually be one. Now let's bring this back to India, because this is the part that actually matters for us. On the 27th of January this year, India finalized its own trade agreement with the EU, after nearly 2 decades of on and off negotiations. Now both sides have called it, and I love this phrase, the mother of all deals. And India took a fundamentally different approach from Mercosur's. First, agriculture barely features in India's deal. That means India sidesteps the entire beef, dairy, sugar minefield that's currently burning Brazil. Second, and this is the smart part, India's real vulnerability is not agriculture, it's carbon. India is a major exporter of steel and cement to Europe, and those exports are directly exposed to something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. In simple terms, CBAM is the charge EU puts on carbon-intensive imports coming from countries with weaker carbon pricing than Europe's own. Instead of waiting to get blindsided the way Brazil was, India proactively wrote a dedicated carbon tax section directly into its FTA, that's the Free Trade Agreement, before any dispute even existed. And built into that section is a fast-track mechanism in order to escalate disputes the moment a regulatory problem even shows up. This chart on your screen lays this exact contrast out visually. Mercosur standing right to compensation, still tied up in court against India's fast-track escalation route on carbon agreed upfront. It's worth pausing on that graphic because it captures in one image what I've just spent several minutes unpacking in words. Two very different insurance policies written at two very different moments. So the question is, has India been shortchanged compared to Mercosur? I'd argue no. I'd argue India read its own risks very correctly. It avoided the fight Mercosur is having over agriculture entirely, and it got ahead of the fight it actually faces, which is carbon. But the story isn't finished. There are two negotiating tracks still open between India and the EU. One on investment protection, one on geographical indications or GIs, which is the legal protection for regional products. Think champagne or Darjeeling tea tied to where they're made. Those two open tracks are India's remaining opportunity to write in the same kind of guarantee Mercosur has. Not just being told when the carbon tax changes, but locking in a guaranteed reciprocal benefit when it does. So here's the big takeaway. Brazil waited 25 years for its deal and lost part of its market 11 days later. But the lesson isn't that trade deals are risky. The lesson is that the safest agreements are the ones that spell out, before any dispute even happens, exactly what each side is entitled to if the other side changes the rules. Mercosur built that insurance into its treaty and is now defending it in court. India still has two chances left to write that same insurance into its own deal, while there's no crisis forcing the terms. Now, that's the whole idea in one sentence. The cheapest guarantee is the one you write down before you even need it. Thank you for watching.